Okay, hi everybody. Tonight we are at our second to last lecture. I can't believe how fast time flew by this semester. I know you all have gone through so much adversity this semester, so I look forward to my Monday nights getting to see your faces and getting to talk to you about my favorite topic, which is development. Today we're going to go over cognitive development in adolescents, and what's really great about how far we are in the semester is a lot of the components that we're going to be talking about we've already addressed in middle childhood and early childhood, and now we just kind of get to talk about how it's advanced in adolescence. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about brain changes. Even though we talked a little bit about this in physical development, we're going to talk about the cognitive component of these brain changes. I love this visual because it's so accurate. The teen brain is still under construction, even though if you asked any teenager, they think that they're done and they're just as adult as any of us. So it's really interesting to see their perspective compared to what really is happening in their brain. So at this stage, teens become capable of abstract thinking. So they're able to look at multiple points of view when they come to a problem, which makes them really good at the scientific method. They can form ideas about, well, I wonder if I try this, maybe this would happen. And then they engage in the experiment portion of the scientific method. And then they come up with an actual theory of how things work. That kind of thinking is really advanced, and Piaget says that not all people actually get to experience that, that type of abstract thinking. With that in that same breath, I want to also tell you this can also be why teens at this age also question authority and challenge social norms, because they're really starting to form their own ideas of how the world should be and how they feel about certain topics. So it's this really incredible transition to, here's my foundation, here's what my family has taught me to believe. Now I'm getting introduced to all these different things, and now I'm having to combine the two or completely separate myself from the two and form my own identity. And a lot of this change is happening in the brain. Children at this age have developed something called cognitive empathy, or what Piaget refers to as a theory of mind. It's the ability to take the perspective of and feel concern for others. That's an important step in cognitive development. To feel empathy is something that we want to instill in children at a very young age, but then to know what to do with that empathy is just as important in adolescence. What's interesting is this happens in the brains of young girls earlier than it does in young boys. And it's important to consider what's happening in their socialization that's causing girls to have this feeling of empathy before boys do. We talked last week about the development of the prefrontal cortex and what that means for behavior. Do you remember what the prefrontal cortex is responsible for? All those really important things like decision making, behavior inhibition, regulation, things that adolescents are working on, but not great at yet. And when does that prefrontal cortex actually fully develop? Not until the age of 25. So neurologists actually consider teenage years and adolescence to go past 18 and actually into 25 years old. A fun fact, actually, the lack of development of the prefrontal cortex has actually been a defense in some murder trials of individuals under 25 years old, that their prefrontal cortex was underdeveloped and therefore they did not have any control over their actions. And people have gotten away with murder because of that fact about how our brains develop. Now, that's not giving you permission to go murder if you're under 25 years old, but I am saying that it's been used as a strong defense. There's also greater awareness of their potential capabilities. So adolescents have a more accurate view of what they can do and what they can do with their skills that they've obtained throughout their earlier years of childhood. Questions? All right, we're going to cover each of these in a little bit of detail with the exception of Kohlberg a little bit because we talked about him so much in middle childhood. So we're going to go over Piaget's formal operation stage. We're going to go over Elkind, who a lot of his theory was based on Piaget. And then we're going to go over Gilligan, who she talks about a different type of stages for morality. Okay, so let's keep going. So Piaget says that this last stage in development is called formal operations. And why he calls them formal is that adolescents use that hypothetical deductive reasoning. They're, again, making that hypothesis. They're deciding, how do I see whether this hypothesis is true or false? They're able to use logic in their thinking. And again, he says that not even some adults aren't always in formal operations. Sometimes they go back to concrete operations and fluctuate between concrete and formal operations. This egocentrism, it's actually called adolescent egocentrism. And I don't know if you remember, but when we were talking about early childhood with 3-year-olds, we talked about this concept of egocentrism, that inability to see from other people's perspectives. But when we talk about adolescent egocentrism, we're talking about this focus, this heightened focus on themselves. They are the most important people in that universe. Their feelings are unique to everybody. They're the only people that have ever felt that way ever. What Piaget says is that the only way to resolve that adolescent egocentrism is for adolescents to take on more adult roles. So have a job, take care of younger siblings, take leadership roles in school. That's one way to make it not so much about them and to see other perspectives. Questions about this? No? Okay, keep going. So Elkind came up based on Piaget and his formal operations and said, well, there's some other really interesting things that are happening based on this egocentrism. He said all the physiological changes that are occurring in the child's brain and body causes some other phenomenons to happen. And one of these things is an imaginary audience. So if you've ever seen how much importance adolescents place on their appearance, it's really clear to see what Elkind was talking about when he talked about an imaginary audience. It's this belief that everyone is just as invested in how I look and how I appear and how I behave as I am. So I really like this image because this is what I picture adolescents seeing when they walk down the hallway. Like everyone's judging them on what they're wearing, on if they have a pimple, on how cute they look today, on if they're smart or not. Like that's how adolescents think, that everyone is focused on them and they are the center of that universe. This is why a lot of times they're so self-conscious, because if you thought that everyone was focused on you, you would be a little bit self-conscious too. Think about when you're presenting in front of a class. A lot of us get nervous because we think, oh gosh, everybody's looking at me. Adolescents think everyone is looking at them all of the time. So that level of self-consciousness is always there. Elkind talked about another component called the personal fable. And this is that idea, I remember it fondly. I'm actually seeing it with my own child. And it's that belief that one is unique, special, and invulnerable to harm. Where I see it is, well, you just don't understand. Like I'm feeling something, I got in a fight with my friends and my feelings are hurt. And if I try to relate in any way, it's no, well, you don't understand. It's not the same thing. You don't know how I'm feeling. And it's that personal fable that I'm the only one that's ever experienced this. This also contributes to that risky behavior. So this is a lot of the times where we get teen pregnancy or experimentation with drugs or speeding when we talk about teen driving in a second, because it's this idea of, oh, well, that won't happen to me. That consequence isn't going to happen to me. I'm above that. I'm beyond that. It doesn't relate to me. And that's when you get adolescents who get into a lot more trouble. This next component is called hypocrisy. And I see this all the time when we talk about social media. Think about the posts that are being posted to Insta and posted to, I'm learning about all these new things, TikTok, and I don't know if anyone still uses Facebook, but Facebook. And it's this idea of I have to post perfection. I have to post the expensive cars, and I have to edit the pictures of my body so that it looks to what society expects me to be and to look like. And they're pretending to be somebody that they're really not, and it's called hypocrisy. This next term, I don't really think it's the best term to use, but this is what Elkind talks about. It's called pseudo-stupidity. And it's this, if you've ever had an adolescent in your life or you remember this stage, it's this way that teens approach a situation. Like they make it harder than it needs to be. It's a simple problem, a simple task, but the way they go about doing it just makes it look a lot more complex. You probably have seen this, and a lot of the responses, do you have any common sense? Like, use your common sense. But at this age, what Elkind calls pseudo-stupidity kicks in, and they're overthinking some of these tasks and making them harder than they need to be. Questions about this? No. Okay. Now, Gilligan, she talked about morality of care. And when she talks about adolescence, she talks about the 3 different positions of morality that individuals can take. The first position is survival orientation. And this is, I am the most important. My needs are more important than anybody else's. And you might think, oh gosh, that's a really selfish person. And maybe that can lead to some selfishness, but sometimes we need children to have that morality of survival orientation. Your book gives a perfect example of survivors of abuse. We need them to put aside the fear of hurting other people's feelings or getting in trouble, and know that if I need help, I need to put my needs first before anybody else's. So in that area, that idea of self-care is important. Thinking about you as a student right now, and you have so many other people who depend on you, but it's so important to say, you know what, right now I just need 10 minutes to myself. I need to put my needs ahead of everyone else's. And in our society, a lot of times people make it seem like that's a selfish choice, but a lot of times it's survival. In order to survive, I need 10 minutes to myself to just breathe. And that's okay sometimes. The second one she talks about is conventional care. And this is placing the welfare of others ahead of our own, which some might say, oh, wow, how selfless, that's incredible, we should strive to be that way. But not always. Again, think about that teen who, let's say, needs to, I'm trying to think of a good example. That teen who's very, very bright academically, but her friends make her feel like, well, when you get a good grade on your test, it makes me feel bad about myself. So that person puts her friend's need for acceptance and need to feel smart ahead of her own, and she dumbs herself down and she says, oh, I failed that test too, or oh, that was so hard, because she's putting other people's needs ahead of her own. So that's not always a positive. What Gilligan says is this integrated model of caring is what we should kind of strive for. And it's a coordination of personal values and needs and those needs and values of others. And it's according to a situation. Each situation is going to require something different. Questions? No? Okay. So at this point, I just want to do an overview of memory, because we've gone over memory. We've gone over the different stages of memory. So I just want to give you this reminder. So we get sensory signals in our world. We see something, we read something, we hear something, we smell something. And those are the sensory signals that go into sensory memory. That's the first step. Our sensory memory then gets transferred into short-term memory. And in order to keep it in short-term memory and use it, we have to do some rehearsal, and we have to do some practice, and we're going to talk about mnemonic devices and memory strategies in a second, but that's how we're able to use it. So short-term memory is also a part of working memory, so being able to use it on a test, being able to use it in the moment, that all happens in that short-term memory. In order for it to transfer to long-term memory, we need to do a lot more practice with it. We need to talk about it often. We need to study. We need to teach it to somebody else. Those are all strategies to transfer from short-term to long-term. We also need to take care of our bodies, right? We need sleep and we need nutrition. That's another way that we can transfer from short-term to long-term memory. And then in the retrieval process, what we need to do is make sure that we are constantly being reminded of that information. If it's not moved to long-term memory, then when we go to recall it, it's completely forgotten. So think about that when we're working with adolescents. Questions? No. So let's look at some of these retrieval methods. We talk about retrieval, we're talking about how do we get memory from long-term into working or into short-term. And there's 3 different things in order to remember. It's recall, recognition, and relearning. Which one do you think is harder? I just want you to think about that for a second. If you're saying recall, then you'd be right. That would be like me meeting one-on-one with each of you and telling me, name all the theorists that we've discussed throughout the semester. No notes, no cues, nothing. It would be a lot harder than these multiple choice tests that I'm giving you. The multiple choice tests, they are looking for recognition as your form of retrieval, because you see one of the options and you're like, hey, I've seen that before. I know that term. And what it does is it sparks that memory to come from your long-term to your working, or through your short-term into your working memory. The third one is relearning. That's exactly what it sounds like. Your book has a great example of language as a relearning tool. And let's say in middle school, you took 2 years of Spanish, and now you're having to take it again in college because you don't remember any of it. You're having to completely relearn it. I think I've told this class this before, but students forget 80% of what they learned from the previous day, which as instructors, we're like, oh, that sucks. Like all this work we're putting into teaching, and our students forget 80% of it anyways. But when you take into account everything that you're taking in, 20% isn't bad. If you walk away from the class with 20%, we're hoping that it's good 20%. It's a foundation 20%. But how do you make sure that it stays there? How do you lock it into your memory? The first strategy is know what to know. Not only just rote memory like facts and dates and percentages, but know this on a foundational level. Know this on a conceptual level. Transfer from short-term to long-term using some of those mnemonic devices, and then strengthen memory. So things like rehearsal, things like using acronyms. We talked about PEMDAS, right? Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, to remember the order of operations in math. So use different strategies to hold it in that memory and be able to use it for the long term. Questions? No? Okay. So adolescence is what we know as a time of transitions. Children are going through so many changes in adolescence and getting to experience so many new things. One of these is academic achievement. We know that adolescents are spending more time in school than any other context in their lives. That's a big part of who they are, is their school. And when we talk about academic achievement, we're not just talking about the information, the content. It's a combination of interpersonal. So how were their social relationships? Were they able to interact with others? Did they have healthy relationships? It's also an interpersonal transition. So do I know who I am as a person? Do I know where I'm going? Do I know how to handle my emotions? Do I know how to name my emotions? And then it's an institutional factor as well. So did I have access to a decent school system? Did I have access to different intellectual challenges? Did I have teachers that believed in me? Those all come together to make up academic achievement. This status dropout rate, what we know, especially due to Obama's Every Student Succeeds Act, one of his big goals was to make sure that the high school dropout rate declined, and it has. It's declined from almost 10% to 5.4% in 2007. So we know that there has been a decrease of how many students actually drop out of high school, which is a good thing. But the fact that we still have children dropping out of high school is something that we need to work on as a society. Now, then we have adolescents in the workforce. I know I personally come from a family where if I wanted anything extra, I had to work. I was not getting anything extra. And so I started working from a very young age. I was 12 years old and I was babysitting friends' children. And at that point, I was making as much money as one of my parents. And it was a good learning experience for me. But I'll never forget, because then I started working as I got older in the fast food industry. And I worked at McDonald's and I worked at Mountain Mike's Pizza. And that money, let me tell you, it was great. Being 15, 16 years old, I'm like, yes, I'm able to buy all these things. I'm able to pay some bills. But what started slipping were my grades. I started seeing money as this great open door for my future and not looking at academics as an important factor. And it was interesting to read some of the statistics that go along with adolescents who work more than 20 hours a week, which was definitely me, and at the time was actually illegal for any kind of employer to work anybody under the age of 18 more than 20 hours a week. But I still was. And some of those concerns were a decline in academic achievement, complete disengagement in school, increased sexual behavior, pregnancy, more likely to use substance abuse. And it's this transition of, well, I have this money, so I'm really independent now and I can make my own decisions. And it was interesting to read that there's actually statistics linked to that. So working in adolescence, while there could be some positives like teaching responsibility and how to manage money, we have to be really careful as adults to look at how much our teens working. Are they working to the point that everything else is falling to the wayside? Okay, questions about that? No, okay. All right, teen drivers. So my own child, I remember when we started looking at high schools, the high school that she wants to go to is completely across town on the other side of town from us. And her justification was, well, you only have to drive me for 2 years and then I'll have my license and a car, which I laughed really hard at because I thought, oh, well, that's a great dream. I'm sure you'll be able to afford all that insurance and have my permission to drive, but she had it all planned out. But it's true that a lot of teens, that's what they look forward to. Well, now I get to drive. I get the sense of independence. I get a little bit of freedom outside of my family's home. So it's something that teens definitely look forward to. But we know that it could be a dangerous road. So motor vehicle accidents are the leading cause of death for 15 to 20-year-olds. And there's a lot of components that go into that. We know that males are at greater risk than females. If you look at the insurance rates for drivers under 25, they're almost triple for young men. They're double for young women, but they're even higher for young men. 81% of fatalities from teen drivers, those drivers had an alcohol level that was higher than the legal limit. So the relationship between alcohol and fatalities in motor vehicle accidents, there's a strong causation. They're also less likely to use seatbelts, which is just so interesting. Remember, we talked about how teens view rewards and consequences differently than adults do. The rewards matter more than the consequences. This is a huge part of this less likely to use seatbelts and risky behavior while they're driving, because the rewards that they're getting, like, oh, look at how cool I look without a seatbelt. It's uncomfortable right now in the moment to wear the seatbelt. That matters more than the consequences of flying out of the window if I crash this car. Some of the risk factors, especially for teens, are following too closely. So just being right up behind somebody else's car, driving too fast for the weather. So we all know how slippery the roads can get, and they're not controlling their speed. And then distraction, especially from passengers and cell phones. Some of the new technology is really great in that it automatically turns phones off when they get in the car, which I think is a wonderful idea. So unless they're completely stopped, they can't use their phones while they're driving. Yeah. Questions about this? No. All right, and as promised, this is the last slide. The last part of this section of your textbook talks about the difference between knowledge or intellectual ability and wisdom. And I like this quote from Anthony Douglas Williams. It's knowledge comes from learning, but wisdom comes from living. And so while we can have a straight A student who's extremely intellectual, has an incredible IQ score, until they actually live life, there's not as much wisdom there. And they can be the smartest person in the world, but again, that common sense, that idea of how to be a person in this world, some individuals never have that much wisdom. And it's really interesting to differentiate the difference between intellectual knowledge and wisdom from living. Okay. And so I will go ahead and stop the recording on that note.